Good afternoon. This meeting with the press that we are now holding as members of the G20 Troika serves the purpose of providing you with an overview of the work we've been doing since yesterday when we, the ministers, met for the first time in the evening. First, to listen to President Mauricio Macri, who was kind enough to join us during part of the event we held at the Palacio San Martín building of the Foreign Ministry, during which President Macri made two comments. The first one on Argentina and the economic reform process being carried out by our country, and the measures adopted in recent weeks, and the prospects for growth which Argentina has. The second line of his comments had to do with the goals and the perception that the president, as the leader in charge of the presidency pro tempore of the G20, wants to actually follow, and especially he conveyed his vision with a view to the Leaders' Summit in November later on in this year. Throughout all of the meetings we've had, the informal conversations and many of the bilateral meetings which have taken place, since these G20 gatherings also give us an opportunity to hear from our counterparts from the different members issues and matters relating to the bilateral agenda. We've had rich, rewarding meetings, and we think we've had a highly productive and fruitful working session. I think it's good to mention that the mechanism of the meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs is not exactly a working group or work stream like the ones you would otherwise find in the G20. You will have seen already that a number of meetings have already taken place in a country, working meetings, some of them attended by ministers. There will continue to be working meetings. And as we approach the end of the presidency pro tempore, nearly all of these working meetings will also lead up to a ministerial level meeting. Instead, the meetings of the ministers are decided by the presidency, and this has been the third meeting of foreign ministers. The first one was convened by Mexico, and then, with some intervals in between, we had the one organized by Germany. And I think after this third invitation extended by Argentina, we will have an opportunity next year, as has been announced by Minister Kono, to meet again with the foreign ministers for a dialogue that only has as an agenda that which is proposed by the foreign minister of the convening G20 country. And this time we focused on thinking, first of all, in terms of how the G20 is functioning, what we find we are doing right, what we should do for it to work even better, and also to reflect on the main concerns which each of the member countries of the group has vis-à-vis international developments, and especially with regard to issues which are particularly important today regarding the productivity or efficiency of the multilateral coordination mechanisms. I would like to seize this opportunity to thank so many foreign ministers from so many countries for being here, and countries which are extremely important to us. On the one hand, this bears testimony to support for the mechanism of the G20 and to the commitment of foreign ministers to its work. But at the same time, it bears witness to the support for Argentina, which we particularly value at this time, and this has given President Macri an opportunity to reflect together with the ministers on the importance of this support, which is support that we have been receiving from G20 countries, not just for this specific instance, but also in terms of the general approach of our structural reforms, which will make our country efficient, competitive, and will lead to its enhanced integration with the rest of the world, which is our aspirational goal, as we think that sort of integration will allow us to have more productivity and competitiveness, which will also mean more jobs on the domestic front. We organize these meetings on the one hand because there's a need for dialogue. In the case of foreign ministers, we can engage in dialogue without having the constraints of having to come up with a communique or a document or coming up with a position that will then have to be included in the final declaration. We do this to engage in a dialogue with regard to how our countries are doing and where we think we should be heading. And also, given the importance of the G20 and the meaning and systemic impact of G20 decisions, this is an opportunity to take stock of the important issues at hand and of the need to address these issues and give answers to our societies. We think this dialogue has been very enriching and has allowed us to see the way things stand around the world. We all agree on the challenges in terms of the changes that are taking place. This is a changing world with significant challenges, especially in terms of the technological transformation, which is happening so rapidly and to such a large extent. In 2008, we had already faced another issue of great impact, the economic financial crisis. And that was when the G20 really showed its credentials, because it somehow managed to come up with an answer and contain the crisis to prevent it from becoming another crisis, which everyone had in mind, which was the financial crack of 1929. But now, in view of the new technological challenges, what we call the fourth industrial revolution, we need to find answers, because this has a great impact on the system of work, on the workforce, on the way we produce, and there's also a need for us to readapt and reskill for the new tasks. This is why the Argentine presidency has made this one of the core themes of the G20, and this is why in early September the meeting of the education work stream will be taking place in conjunction with the meeting of the work stream on work. And they will get together because you can't possibly look at the labor market without thinking about reskilling and retraining our workforce to prepare it for the challenges lying ahead. The G20 has a task ahead of it, which has to do with the fact that as our societies and institutions are being called into question by our populations from within, our populations want greater response capabilities. And at the same time, multilateral institutions and coordination bodies like the G20 must respond. People look to the G20 meeting and ask, what have you produced to improve the lives of each and every one of us, and where are you taking us or guiding us to? And hence the importance of us at the end of the November summit being able to come up with guidance and guidelines that show we are working to build consensus that will be inclusive and as part of which we will all be on board. I think it is highly important for us to bear this goal in mind. Argentina feels deeply honored and is proud of holding the presidency of the G20 in 2018. And I think that all of the Argentine people should value the importance of Argentina sitting at the table with the 20 largest economies of the world, but especially the fact that we are sitting at a table that works for a better future. And in this regard, we have relied on the cooperation of all countries that have preceded us, especially Germany, the most recent president pro tempore before ourselves, and we'll continue to work together with a view to the Japanese presidency. Thank you very much to all of you, Mr. Minister.
Dear Jorge, thank you so much for hosting this G20 summit. From our own experience, we know just how much planning goes into organizing such an event. And on behalf of all participants, allow me to express my gratitude and thank you for organizing this event. And thank you for showing such a great deal of hospitality. Thank you for hosting us in this beautiful, wonderful country. As presidency of the past year and as Troika member, we are happy and delighted that the format of the G20 meeting on the level of foreign ministers is being continued. And at the same time, we are happy and delighted that with Japan, dear Taro, another close partner of Germany, will host the G20. And I am very certain that we will pass on the baton well, and I'm looking forward to the deliberations in Japan next year. It is important that the G20 foreign ministers engage in an exchange in these times because the central issues of the G20 affect to a great and ever-growing deal foreign policy. And this was also could be seen in the discussions last year in Hamburg. The G20 agreed on lending support to multilateralism, to foster the Agenda 2030, and to intensify efforts for a rules-based world order. And the G20 members clearly said no to any form of protectionism. Dear Jorge, the topics that were on the agenda today follow up seamlessly, and they intensified our discussion. Multilateralism, global governance were on the agenda. Also, fair and sustainable development was in the focus of our agenda. And many of the topics and conflicts we're dealing with on the international stage just show how much multilateralism is under pressure from various angles right now. We see that the principle that all states play according to the same fair rules, we see this principle challenged in a way that fulfills us with great concern. And this is why it is important from our point of view that the G20 find a common and strong answer to these challenges. In our view, the G20 are supposed to be a forum that is dedicated to fair, reliable, and just cooperation among states, and I think we impressively showed this today. This holds true for trade-related matters. Germany is committed to free and fair trade. It is the motor for any economic development, and internationally we work for establishing a just and legal trade system that includes WTO dispute settlement mechanisms, which we deem to be very important. And this is why isolationist tendencies are something that fulfill me with great concern, and these are issues that we discussed today. The G20 have a key role when it comes to combating climate change and when it comes to reaching the targets contained in the Agenda 2030, and we have to work to implement the Paris Agenda. And in order to reach the goals defined in the Agenda 2030, and of course with the Action Plan 2030, we initiated this in Hamburg, and today we worked hard in order to continue down this path. Dear Jorge, once again, thank you so much for hosting this excellent meeting and this event, and you personally, by moderating this event, lent a major contribution to the fact that this was a very successful day for the G20.
Thank you. Well, I am honored to attend this joint press conference as a Troika member, along with Foreign Minister Foreing, who chaired this G20 Foreign Ministers meeting this time, and German Foreign Minister, Mr. Mars. We had a very fruitful discussion last night and today. We, as the ministers in charge of our respective states' foreign policy, held frank discussions, which will contribute to the theme of this year's G20 summit in November, building consensus for fair and sustainable development. I am grateful that Minister Foreing chaired the meeting again, and we will continue working closely with each other towards the summit meeting in November. Next year, Japan will host a G20 summit meeting in Osaka on June 28th and 29th, as well as 8 ministerial meetings throughout the year. Japan will again host the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Nagoya on November 22nd and 23rd, 2019. As next G20 president, Japan will try to demonstrate strong leadership in sustainable and inclusive growth and stability, as well as in leading efforts to tackle the global challenges. As the global economy is steadily recovering, it is important to strengthen growth further in the world through advancing free trade and innovation. In the face of growing inequality due to globalization, we will hold discussions with the view to realize inclusive and sustainable international society. We will host next year's Foreign Ministers meeting at the conclusion of our presidency, and will use that occasion to sum up our contribution throughout the year 2019. We firmly intend to demonstrate that the G20 will continue to play a major role in growth and prosperity of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taro. We are now for whatever the questions are.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes, Ezequiel Chavoy.
Ezequiel Chavoy from Cronista Comercial newspaper. I will ask a question on behalf of our Argentine colleagues. Since you have decided to discuss multilateralism in the context of global governance, what are your comments on the recent economic turbulence, which had an impact on Argentina and in other countries following the interest rate hike in the United States? Has further cooperation been requested, or have you considered joint action lines to deal with these fluctuations? Since this was a unilateral decision, is there a consensus view regarding the approach to this financial issue? And reference has been made to the pressure suffered by multilateralism. How do you view this, taking the multilateral financial system into account? Well, as host, I will start to answer myself. First of all, let me say that we have been working a lot on the approach to multilateralism and what it is that multilateralism should change, or what flexibility should be envisaged in order to rise to the challenges. That is the first part of the answer. We have all agreed that it's better to keep and have multilateralism, of course, although we must reach agreement to undertake reforms where needed, and obviously be flexible as well in order to adapt to new realities. The G20 mechanism has a particularly strong component on the economic and financial front. This is the finance track, which in the case of Argentina is presided over by the Minister of the Treasury. And this is a coordination mechanism which enables dialogue in order to resolve matters that have taken place, like the situation in 2008, but also to deal with circumstances which Argentina itself is currently going through. And certainly, the G20 countries have a shared view in terms of the spirit of reforms and the coordination that reforms require, because virtually all G20 countries individually have spoken in support of the reforms needed by Argentina, expressing their support, those which are on the IMF, to actually follow up the request made by Argentina. Any other question?
In Germany, U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo today drastically increased the pressure on the Iranian regime. He threatened the harshest sanctions ever, and he said that the U.S. will hold accountable all companies which do business with Iran. What's your take on that, and especially to the German Foreign Minister Maas? What is the range of maneuver of the Europeans who still stick to the JCPOA? And as you are meeting Secretary Pompeo on Wednesday, what is your attitude you go into in the meeting? What do you expect? And lastly, aren't you afraid that after the harsh Iran speech today, Mr. Trump will impose punitive tariffs on June 1st on steel and aluminium? Thanks.
Well, we, of course, took note of the U.S.'s position this morning, and one has to say that the speech of Foreign Minister Pompeo contained many elements of the statement issued by President Trump, so we were not surprised. I will travel on to Washington and will meet Mike Pompeo on Wednesday, and thus will use the opportunity to talk to him directly. For us, the situation remains unchanged. We, and I mean thus with we, I mean the Europeans. The Europeans have sent out a very united signal in Sofia. We want to preserve and salvage the Vienna JCPOA, the Iran deal, because it is an added plus of security and transparency for us in Germany and in Europe, because Iran is in our wider neighborhood. And since we don't see any better alternative at present, and this is why we don't want to leave the deal. We don't want Iran to engage in a nuclear weapons program. This affects immediate German security interests and security interests of Europe, and this is the reason why we want to stay in the deal. And we want to continue to work together with our partners in Europe, but also with the co-signatories. As regards the discussions surrounding the punitive tariffs, time is going to, run out. I don't have any further comments other than the Commissioner of the European Union, Cecilia Malmström, which made it very clear that we're willing to engage in a dialogue and we're willing to negotiate. But, of course, we don't want to be pressured and put under pressure. This is why we will take a closer look at the American position, and we will be able to see whether there will be a solution by way of negotiations.
Thank you. I'm Makiko Yanada from the Yomiuri Shimbun, a Japanese daily newspaper. My question is to Japanese Foreign Minister, Mr. Kono. You listed your concept about the sustainable and inclusive development as the next year's main theme. And in concrete meaning, I think one of the main topic relating to that theme is a highly qualified infrastructure that now Japanese government is really pressing. So if you raise that topic in today's discussion, I'd like to know the response to your response from other participant countries to your suggestion. And also, I have another question. That is. My other question is that if we stand for the view that the security is the basis for sustainable and inclusive economic growth, G20 formula may be utilized in that sense. So, I'd like to know, although G20 framework is basically for economic-related matters, I'd like to know what do you think of making use of this forum as forum for discussion on security matters? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. G20 is the premier forum for international economic cooperation, and it's not the case the foreign ministers meeting always happen during G20. But I think it's meaningful for foreign ministers of G20 members to get together and have free and candid discussion on pressing issues such as democracy or global governance. Sustainable and inclusive growth cannot be realized through economy only. So I think it is important to talk about political and strategic issue as well. It is maybe good forum to talk about the security issues. I mentioned about North Korea throughout the discussion today, and some people raised the issue of security. So in the future, G20 foreign ministers meeting may be utilized as a good forum for the security discussion. Certainly, in order to realize the sustainable development, I think we need to talk about the politics and other issues. So we are very much looking forward to next year's foreign ministers meeting, which will come at the end of the G20 next year. I mentioned about the quality infrastructure. I think it is important to stress transparency or openness or peaceful usage of infrastructure or the soundness of a recipient country's debt situation. We need to keep international standard for those major infrastructure projects. There are quite a few foreign ministers who mentioned about the need for infrastructure investment. So we will consider what's going to be in the foreign ministers meeting agenda next year, but infrastructure is certainly, and the connectivity through infrastructure project certainly necessary to realize sustainable growth. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, Carmen de Carlos.
Good afternoon, Carmen de Carlos, ABC Newspaper, Spain. Foreign Minister Foreing, in the context of the declaration you provided this morning, well, half a dozen foreign ministers of the G20 regarding Venezuela, I would like to hear about the reasons why Brazil, such a close partner of Argentina's, hasn't actually endorsed that statement. And what is your view regarding the participation of former President Rodríguez Zapatero in the Venezuelan election process and his support for it? Well, if you don't mind, all those of you who wish to ask questions regarding Venezuela will address those matters when I'm on my own after the G20 conference. I will stay in the room to discuss what's been done on the margins of the G20 in that regard. Good afternoon, Natalia Pecoraro, La Nación newspaper. I'd like to ask the ministers from Germany and Japan. Germany, is there anything on the agenda that Argentina has not followed up on or has not really worked further on after your presidency last year? Is there any other matter you would have liked Argentina to work on more intensively or to leave out, perhaps? And for the Japanese minister, do you regard the inputs of the Argentine G20 presidency as valuable, and what role do you see for Argentina in the Troika next year? Thank you.
I can answer your question with no. But allow me to elaborate on it some further, because it would be too little if I would only draw your attention to the fact that the Argentinian presidency did not leave anything out. No, I think the right priorities were set, and I think this has been also shown in the discussion. The discussion was very broad, and we had a dinner last night, and the dinner showed it very clearly. We addressed those issues that we're confronted with as foreign ministers right now, the multilateralism, sustaining peace, but also we addressed trade-related matters, economic matters, the future of work, the training and education of young people in the various regions. I think the Argentinian presidency made a great job to continue addressing the issues that were on the agenda in Hamburg, not only to follow up on them, but indeed they were also further developed content-wise, and this is the way it should be, and this is why we have this instrument of Troika, that the previous presidency cooperates together with the current presidency and the incoming presidency, that we're in close coordination and talk about the fact that topics don't only come up once, because we want to make processes sustainable. We want things to be followed up on, and I think the Argentinian presidency did a remarkable and marvelous job.
Well, Japan would like to make a contribution towards the theme of this year's G20 meetings, building consensus for fair and sustainable development. And next year, I think it's something like inclusive and sustainable development will be the key theme for the G20 in Osaka. We hope that Foreign Minister Foreing to support us as a member of the Troika in G20 Foreign Ministers meeting. And Argentina, we are counting on Argentina's support for the summit meeting to make it successful. So very much looking forward to working closely with Argentina and the Foreign Minister Foreing. Thank you.
Puede contar con ese compromiso.
You can certainly count on that commitment from us for our work next year. One last question, please.
Thank you. Luis now with the Associated Press. A potential trade war dominated past meetings, so I wanted to get your take on the United States' decision to suspend tariffs on China. If that was discussed, and what's your opinion? Thanks.
Creo que en el momento
I believe when we met, all of us present did have some positive thoughts on the dialogue between the United States and China in recent days, with a view to finding a solution to the differences in a mutually acceptable manner. This reference was made both by the Chinese Counselor of State and Foreign Minister, who talked about this and about the interest in upholding the free trade system and in also negotiating with partner countries, trade partners. And the U.S. Secretary of State referred to the clearly liberal origins of the U.S. economy, and in this regard highlighted the commitments of the United States in the context of the United States' interest to keep a free trade system. Very well. Thank you very much. I would like to ask all those of you who would like to stay on with regard to Venezuela to please do so. I'll be at your disposal.
Taro, I will see you in a few minutes. Okay? Thank you. Muy bien. A disposición para Venezuela ahora y retomo su pregunta.
Well, regarding Venezuela, and going back to your question, you asked about the position of Brazil. Brazil is part of the Lima Group. The Lima Group issued a communique this morning, mid-morning, which reflects the views of all those of us who have worked on this matter, and I think there you will find the answer. And as for Brazil not having taken part in the statement, that's a question obviously for Brazil to answer, but we made this statement because we thought this was a particularly important meeting of G20 countries, and many of the G20 member countries have worked very much with regard to Venezuela, and we couldn't just overlook what happened yesterday during the election in Venezuela. And Argentina was supported by a number of countries, which you will have seen join me during these statements, and that is the spirit. In Venezuela, what happened yesterday did not restore democracy. It only confirmed the authoritarian deviation, and this is why the countries that issued the statement do not recognize the result of the election. I would say it is not for me to speak about events that should be considered within the context of Spanish politics. President Rodríguez Zapatero has been involved in different stages of negotiating process, which were not successful, and which have also ended up leading to the situation we see now. Good afternoon, Mr. Minister. Considering the declaration today and the call for consultations of the Lima Group ministers, the government of President Maduro is increasingly isolated. And I wonder, after 2 to 3 years of increased isolation, have you actually considered whether this has led to any kind of improvement or whether it has just brought additional complications in the country situation? Because it seems that no matter how much economic or diplomatic pressure, no matter how many sanctions may be imposed on the regime in Caracas, all that seems to matter is for, at least for the high levels, to stay in power. And in the G20 context, considering that there are more internationally conflictual issues than ever before, perhaps, does the general spirit of discussion suggest that the tack chosen is correct? I think that all of the decisions made by the Lima Group and individual decisions by a number of countries over the course of the last couple of years have contributed to the government of Maduro not being recognized as legitimate internationally. And this is a positive step. The fact that Maduro's authoritarian regime continues is no justification for them to stay in power. And obviously the questioning will continue to increase, and the deterioration of circumstances in Venezuela actually accentuates the need for countries like ours, which agree on the lack of democracy in Venezuela, to work to help bring about a change in Maduro's regime. That is the strategy that we are pursuing, and its effectiveness is not measured by the fact that Maduro has not yet been removed from office. It's a long road, and we need to stick to it. What we need to do is not to go backwards. Gaston Soulages from the Televisión Pública state network. What does the non-recognition of yesterday's elections mean? What are some concrete measures, some of them announced during the declaration of the Lima Group, and what parallel talks or direct talks have there been during this meeting of Ministers of Foreign Relations of the G20 regarding Venezuela? Well, to begin with, in the G20, Venezuela was not a matter at the center of discussion. We did discuss Venezuela in the context of bilateral talks with a number of delegations, especially with those that closely follow matters in Venezuela. And everyone agreed that there is no full democracy in Venezuela, and the result of the election has not been recognized since the election was called illegitimately by the Constituent Assembly. So we are therefore not in a position to recognize the election. This as regards countries with which, although in the G20 we can't speak to that because it's not part of the G20 agenda. Within the Lima Group, where many of the members are present, we agreed to adopt measures which for example, include the recall of ambassadors to capitals for consultations. We are going to hold consultations with our missions, and we will advance with other kinds of diplomatic measures, aside from the ones we have agreed to consider. We'll have a coordination meeting in Panama with also to do with the follow-up of capital flows. In Argentina, we have a financial investigation unit, which will be taking part. We'll be holding a meeting in Lima to look at migration, which is having an impact, a very important or huge impact in Argentina. In spite of the distance from Venezuela to Argentina, we have over 95,000 Venezuelans, 65,000 of which are already registered as temporary residents in our country. There's still a process that needs to be followed to regularize the situation of another 30,000. But especially after this discouraging result yesterday, we think we will be receiving more Venezuelans, which we, the Argentine people, are receiving because we see them as victims of the lack of democracy to begin with. And in a way, we are reciprocating after the support that Venezuela gave to so many Argentines in the 70s when we had our military dictatorship here. In addition to the meeting on migrations to try and agree on the situation of the people from Venezuela who have emigrated to so many countries in the region, we need to hold a meeting on health, because the impact is very significant in terms of diseases that are starting to spread across the continent, as Venezuelans have no food and no medicines. Even the cattle has no medicines, which means that also animal bovine diseases, among others, are spreading, and they are affecting production in neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil. This is why we'll be holding 3 coordination meetings in addition to the diplomatic steps that we will all be considering and adopting gradually. The expectation all of us in the Lima Group have is for the Venezuelans themselves, with any help we may give them, will find a way out and a way to engage in dialogue among all members of the community to have fair, transparent election with the participation of all political leaders who are currently excluded from the election, as was the case yesterday. One last question. Patrick Gillespie, Bloomberg News. The U.S. government is considering an embargo on Venezuelan oil exports. Does the Venezuelan government support this U.S. government measure? Oil trade between the United States and Venezuela is extremely important in terms of Venezuelan revenue. This has been greatly reduced because, in fact, the Venezuelan oil industry no longer produces the way it used to do, and it is producing roughly 1/3 of what it used to in the past and has huge debt commitments to other countries. So what part of that may reach the U.S. market is debatable. I think the United States is looking at this, and we'll see what developments in the short term are. And this is part of the measures that different countries within the Lima Group and others, including the United States, which have contacts with the Lima Group, are considering. Thank you very much.